Good morning, 7th graders. I'm going to do a video posted on YouTube about the chapter 13. This will be the lecture for chapter 13, and we'll get right into it immediately. The only way the government really had to collect money in taxes back then was through tariffs. And a tariff is a tax on imported goods. Well, the North was a manufacturing part of the country, and the South was agricultural. So the North exported a lot of stuff, and the South imported stuff. So when the North would impose tariffs on imports, it would help the North and it would hurt the South. Well, in 1828, there was a tariff that was passed by the North. It was really pretty bad for the South. It was very expensive. And it was known as the Tariff of Abomination. It was a protective tariff for the North to protect the industries, but it hurt the South. Well, a senator from South Carolina, John C. Calhoun, he was actually, at this point in time, he was Andrew Jackson's vice president. And he basically told Jackson that unless something was done, the state of South Carolina would secede from the Union, which meant leave the Union and become its own country. Well, needless to say, that did not go over very well. Jackson threatened South Carolina, basically said, I'll march the army down there and crush you if you try to secede. And to make a long story short, it was called the nullification crisis. In other words, South Carolina and southern states, several southern states, said that if there is a federal law that is passed that hurts our states, we have the right to ignore that law, nullify it, not pay attention to it. And so this was known as the nullification crisis. So there was this standoff down in South Carolina. They refused to collect the tariffs. They threatened to secede. Andrew Jackson basically threatened to come down there and whoop them. Well, eventually what happened was Congress got together. They compromised, they lowered the tariff, and there was no secession or civil war at that point in time. But it was scary because nobody was quite sure whether a state actually had the right to secede or not. The issue of slavery was getting to be pretty big. In the year 1820, when Missouri wanted to become a state, Congress passed what was called the Missouri Compromise, which basically took everything north of the state of Louisiana in Louisiana Territory and divided it. They drew a line across the territory. Missouri was north of that line. It's the border between Arkansas and Missouri, by the way, in case you're wondering where exactly that line is. And they basically said everything north of that territory, everything north of that line will become free territory with the exception of Missouri. Everything south of that line would be slave territory. So in essence, basically what is today Arkansas and Oklahoma would be slave territory, and then everything north of that, with the exception of the state of Missouri, would be free territory. Missouri could have slaves. So it worked. It passed, and the Missouri Compromise line was just fine. Then along came Texas. Texas became a state, came in as a slave state. As you know, they initially the Congress didn't want them to come in as a state because they knew that they would be a slave state. But eventually in 1845, Texas did come in as a slave state. Now, there was the Mexican-American War and the Mexican Cession. You remember that? At the end of the war, Mexico sold us all of the territory of the southwestern United States from California all the way across, including Utah. So we had all this new territory. Some people said, look, there should be no slavery at all in that territory. And some people down south said, yeah, we should be able to take our slaves in that territory. So it created a big problem. So what they did was they struck a compromise of 1850. And basically there were four parts to the compromise. The first one was that California would come in as a free state. That made everybody up north happy. Okay. The slave trade would be done away with in Washington, D.C. That made everybody up north happy as well. Utah and New Mexico territories, two brand new territories, could vote on whether they wanted slavery or not. And as it turned out, Utah said no. New Mexico said yes, because a lot of the people who moved to New Mexico were from Texas. And then lastly, and the most controversial was the South wanted a strong fugitive slave law so that the northern people would help capture slaves that had escaped, especially the northern like police force, the marshals and sheriffs and things like that. So that was what the Missouri Compromise was all about. California, free state, no slave trade in Washington, D.C., a stronger fugitive slave law, and then New Mexico and Utah could exercise what was called popular sovereignty. The people who lived in those territories would decide if they wanted slavery or not. Well, the fugitive slave law was the big problem because it forced Northerners for the first time to actually become directly involved with slaves. And most Northerners did not want to return slaves. They wanted to help the slaves escape. The problem was that now the entire northern part of the United States was not safe, not only for escaped slaves, but also for free African Americans who could be kidnapped and sent back down south. That's when the Underground Railroad really got busy, because they had to try to smuggle escaped slaves all the way up to Canada out of the country altogether. And that's where Harriet Tubman came in and helped as a conductor of the Underground Railroad. So some northern people said, no, we're not going to support it at all. Sorry, we're not going to do it. And of course, that made Southerners angry. They said, hey, wait, that's part of the deal. That was part of the compromise. Now you're saying you're not going to help us. And a lot of Northerners said, that's right, we're not going to help you. Tough luck. So it created a lot of tension between the two. Of course, it was right about that time Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, which I think it was in 1852, which was actually an abolitionist propaganda book. But a lot of people read it and were angry about how terrible slavery was. And then this is kind of out of order chronologically with what happened, but in 1859, a radical abolitionist by the name of John Brown raided Harper's Ferry, Virginia, to try to get to capture the federal arsenal where all the guns and ammunition was. He wanted to have a slave uprising, and he wanted to arm the slaves. Well, he didn't succeed. He was captured by none other than a United States colonel by the name of Robert E. Lee. He was captured. He was wounded and captured, and he was charged with treason. And in December of 1859, he was executed. He was hanged. But before he was executed, he got to talk to the newspapers, and he basically told them, he said, I have no doubt that the sin of slavery is going to cause a lot of bloodshed in our country. He said, I have no doubt that it's going to cause a civil war, basically. Many Northerners viewed him as a martyr, somebody who died, a righteous person who died for a religious cause, basically. Southerners were shocked. They said this guy was going to have a slave uprising, and he was going to arm the slaves to kill us and our families. If you hate us that much, North, then maybe we ought to leave the Union. Maybe we ought to leave the Union. Because if you Northerners hate us enough to have us killed by our slaves, then we probably should part ways. But we'll wait. We'll wait, because next year in 1860, there's going to be a presidential election, and we'll see if somebody who's friendly to the South will be elected. The abolitionists were very busy trying to do away with slavery as quickly as possible. And abolitionists wanted slavery done away with immediately. Do it right now. And they published newspapers. They went around and spoke, like Frederick Douglass, we had talked about him before, went around the country and spoke about how horrible slavery was. And so consequently, the country was ripping itself apart at this point in time. I do want to point something out interesting from my perspective. I was born in 1959, and John Brown was hanged in 1859. So when I was a baby, there were still some people, probably a couple thousand maybe, people who were still alive, who had lived, who had been babies themselves when a lot of this stuff was taking place, you know. So that's pretty cool to think about, that some people were alive for John Brown's time and were alive for Mike Martling's time too. So yeah, I am that old. All right, that's it for this first part of chapter 13. I will be posting another section, the last part, which is very, very important. Okay, it's really super important for you guys to watch it. You know kind of what's going on. Sorry about the sinuses. Allergies have been terrible. So you guys have a good day, and we'll talk to you later. Bye.